There's a kind of humility that Scripture actually calls disobedience. But to truly understand this, we need to first discuss how to know and discern the will of God. How do we know the will of God for our life, and how do we discern it? Well, a lot of times it starts off as a desire. It starts off as a place that we see a need in the world around us. And in Philippians 2, it says that God both gives us the desire and the will to work out His good pleasure. And we can study the life of Moses as a kind of blueprint for discerning the will of God. And so what we see is that Moses has the desire to save his people. He's witnessing how the Egyptians are treating his brethren, and so he does something about it. But a lot of times when we first have this desire and we move in to walk it out, it's not always smooth sailing. And so he kills an Egyptian, but what ends up happening is he's driven into the wilderness where he spends 40 years. But it's in these 40 years that God is cultivating this desire. And that's the key. God gives you the desire, but then He needs time to cultivate it. And sometimes, the greater the calling, the longer the cultivation. It's in this time that Moses is becoming a husband, a father, a son-in-law, a shepherd. These aren't years wasted. These are opportunities and cultivation for God to grow this calling. So in this season of cultivation, eventually God will bring it to fruition. And I want to relate this story to a parable of Jesus in Luke chapter 14, where He discusses, don't take a seat among the great, because someone more honorable might come and you will be removed back to the bottom of the table. But He says to take a seat at the lower end of the table, and maybe the host will invite you to the front of the table. And a lot of times in this teaching, the focus is on being humble and taking a lower seat. Many times we miss the backside of it about being called to the head of the table. And I think this happens to a lot of us as believers, is that we don't step out in faith. See, God put this desire in you and in Moses, and He wants to call it out and bring it to fruition. And we can see this in Exodus 4, where God is starting to commission Moses. And Moses argues back, saying, I can't speak, I'm a man of few words. And he's questioning, I send someone else, Lord. And it actually says that God became angry with Moses, and then He says, your brother Aaron is coming. And the point of this is, God is inviting Moses to the head of the table, but he's being reluctant to go forward. And I think this happens to us many times. God is inviting us up to the head of the table, however that may look. And we sometimes don't want to go because we want to remain humble. But in this case, it's not actually humbleness, it's actually disobedience. See, God put a desire in you. He gave you the ability to see a need. And He placed you in a situation to cultivate that desire for His will to be done. And then He's calling you to step out in faith and do it. And so when we don't step out in faith, we're not robbing ourselves of glory, we're robbing God of glory. The goal, the purpose isn't to go to the head of the table for our own glory, but for His glory. So as you seek and discern what God's will is for your life, take notice of where He's placed you and the needs around you that He's bringing awareness to, and the desires that He's placing in your heart. And trust that He's going to cultivate it even in the dry seasons, because it's in those seasons where God is really at work. Just like Moses 40 years in the wilderness, becoming a husband, father, shepherd, Jesus says, he who is faithful with little is faithful with much. And this happens in those dry seasons. And so just like the parable says, take a seat amongst the lower and be humble. But when God does call you to the head of the table, so to speak, go forth in faith, step out and trust the desire that God has placed in you and His cultivation. to truly bring honor and glory to Him through your faith. If this teaching blessed you, consider subscribing and following for more content.